Open University.
Happy Christmas. I'm smiling because I'm trying to think of happy things to talk about today. And usually these talks are about sad things. And the world is not all sad. In fact, as my review of the year revealed, although it's been in many ways a terrible year, for me it was also a year full of travel and sunshine and happiness and delights of various sorts. So let's speak about delights. Perhaps I could even improvise some dance moves for delightful things. I've been thinking recently about how you would write a novel or some kind of fiction about the really delightful things. There's a certain moment that happens in my brain when I think I get a childhood memory, half remembered, or it's like a half dream kind of event that happens when I see the world, I see a possible world in which everything is completely different and delightful, and it's like a misperception. It seems like a misperception, but maybe it's a correct perception of life, in which there's just a certain kind of magical aura around things. Perhaps it'll be like an illustration from a 1950s children book of Blossom on a farm, or the silos on a farm, and perhaps there's some memory lodged deep in me of a trip to a friend's farmhouse, Kirby Lonsdale, 1966, or whenever it was. And I think it's quite close to what poets are always trying to touch when they write and use unusual combinations of words or images, or appeal to the olfactory sense, to smell, to trigger some kind of deep, prehensile, reptilian brain imagery of happiness, or some kind of lost joy, which I think when our rational brain predominates, we have this grid over everything. We understand, in order to interact with things, to be instrumental, we sort of understand things in a particular way, and it's the job of art and artists, but also the job of our prehensile memory, if we want to call it that, to break that grid, to smash that piece of glass which is actually pressing down on everything, the glass ceiling in a different sense, and to restore some kind of deep pleasure, which is not judged politically, it's not judged economically, it's something the poor could get as easily as the rich. It's egalitarian in that sense. I haven't tried drugs. I'm sure there are drugs which would actually get you closer to this kind of thing, but I rather like the fleetingness and the rarity of these sensations. I suppose there are states of mind you could get into. I mentioned stained glass when I was doing the Proust questionnaire video. Somehow the idea of a space suffused with colours which are not natural colours of the light, or rather which are filtrations of the light. So they are the real colours, but they're, the glass is doing something strange and diffusing. So churches, of course, have always played with this, but I think more in terms of modernist spaces, and actually the imagery in that video was showing Matisse's chapel in Vence, where he made some modernist stained glass windows. And gosh, yeah, it's something to do with sensual pleasure, but also just to do with the pleasure of a re-experiencing of the childhood brain. I think it's very much to do with your very earliest memories of pleasures. Of course, fears must have been, when you were a baby or a very young child, you're very vulnerable, of course. You're very in touch with the very primal emotions of, fear, hunger, cold, anxieties of various kinds, but you're also your brain it's enormous, and it's not yet filled with any grids of rationality or kind of habit patterns and things, which are to do with, let's say, the Apollonian. We should talk really, this is something Matthew Arnold wrote about in a famous essay which distinguishes between the Apollonian and the Dionysian tendencies. I suppose in his case he was talking about literature, but also in conduct. And Apollo, the god of reason, the god of measure, the god of authority, Dionysus, the god of grapes and of rampage, riot, chaos, turmoil, but also pleasure, but bad things too, like rape and just if it feels good, do it. The sort of Crowleyite spirit of do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law is built into the Dionysian worldview. So rock stars traditionally have been Dionysians, and we like them to get into trouble, to get drunk, to run rampage through the city with grapes in their hair, or drugs in their pockets. I've always been a little bit too Calvinist to be that kind of rock star, but I've lived pretty fully. I have to say, I've had an enormous amount of sex in my life. I've never been a big drinker or a drug taker, but I've enjoyed the sensual pleasures of desire to the maximum, to the hilt, I would say. I think I once said in an interview that my day was structured by waking up and feeling the impulses of desire, really from the moments of first consciousness. And I think it's only now in sort of later middle age, I guess, that I'm a little bit disentangling myself from, I think what Lord Whimsy once called the 200-pound gorilla that was clinging to his back, the monkey on his back. And is 200? I don't even know what is 200 pounds. Is that might be a microscopic gorilla? It might be a little parrot-shaped gorilla that sits on your shoulder. But art and sex have been enormous delights for me. So still, and I think they're connected. I think I've always been very conscious that certain sounds are quite orgasmic and quite deeply connected, or certain chord transitions. I spent a lot of time in my early songwriting career trying to find the magic chord. Not the magic chord which pleased the Lord, which Solomon played, but the magic chord which would somehow be, I don't know, some combination of sophisticated and just inherently pleasure-giving. But of course it's not just one chord, it's a transition of chords and what the vocal line is doing. And there are all sorts of things which you learn just by practicing your craft, give pleasure in songwriting. And for me, pleasure, I think that's why my music is essentially quite soft and self-effacing. People almost have been describing it in some of the reviews of the Pubic Intellectual compilation as music which seems to apologize for even being there. I refute that. I think it's simply low profile and understated, because I like the idea of a sensual music which caresses you. I think it once described as music which would scratch your back. So yeah, it's got to be quite gentle sounding. And that goes with my whole worldview as well. I have basically a gentile worldview, which is, tends towards the quite relaxed and liberal, easygoing libertarian. I don't condemn people for sinful things, but I do condemn people for mediocrity. I think I'm quite judgmental in that sense. If I think that somebody is not really trying to break out of some kind of bubble of, especially there's a certain part of the English personality which I've always had trouble with, which is a self-deprecating complacency. In other words, self-deprecation used not to be modest, as say the Japanese often use it, but to be arrogant and say, I'm not really going to work on improving these flaws which I've identified in myself. I'm just going to rather proudly boast about them and say, well, I'm crap at this, I'm crap at that, And this it's the opposite of all aspiration and inspiration also, in a sense. So yeah, we got a little bit off the track of pleasure there, but there are pleasures in quite Apollonian things too, the pleasures of self-improvement, the pleasures of learning a language, or of understanding a little bit more about the world. I find personally, what I've found is that, let's say I write, you would think I would be a gourmet, having been a food critic for the Japan Times for most of this year. Something I quit. I voluntarily resigned my column because I'd run out of interesting things to say about food, but also because my relationship with food is so problematical. I really resent having to eat, and if there was a pill you could take to replace a meal, I would do that. I don't like sitting in restaurants even. I think some of my early interviews I gave when I first moved to London, I said I'd like to be so successful that I would just be able to go from restaurant to restaurant all day, presumably with the vomitorium trips in between, But I think I've long since renounce that ambition. Well, it would be boring. I could afford it, obviously. I could go in Japan from restaurant to restaurant and get much better food than in Britain for much more reasonable prices. But after about 6 or 8 columns, I couldn't find any more to write about food. Maybe I should have a sex column and write about that. But I think what I find is that the closer I approach to these particular specific areas of pleasure, especially if they're stereotypical areas of pleasure, like food and sex, is that there's a joylessness which starts to come to the fore. I think I appreciate things best as an amateur. So, for instance, when I write about art, the closer I get into the so-called art world, the less I like it, really. You start to see all the bad things. You start to feel also a lot of professional jealousies, I think, if you're getting a little bit too close into the power struggles, the domination by money, the professional, career things people have to do. As you start to zoom in and zone in on those, you feel, well, actually, I preferred just regarding, as an amateur, coming into galleries, biennials, museum shows, and just saying, I'm just going to walk through here, and things which jump out and speak to me, I'm going to say that's the one thing that I liked in this show, and that's what made it worth coming. Just treat the art world as a cornucopia, overflowing, generous, very hit and miss. Just a huge number of different things which are spread out like a banqueting feast for you to maybe just in a kind of butterfly or bee way, you just get some pollen here and there. So, although I continue to write professionally about art, it's not really a world that I want to get too close to. I don't want to have to go to Basel, Miami, and sort of souk up to dealers and this kind of thing. I've been in situations where I'm introduced to powerful people in the art world, and I tend to just look at my shoes in those situations. When I was a working artist in New York, I found there was this strange kind of force field, negative force field. Whenever you approached a critic, like Jerry Saltz, for instance, looked like he would do anything to avoid speaking to me. Might have been different if I'd been a pretty girl, but he sort of made a beeline to the door. He liked my show. He gave it a good review, and his wife Roberta also did. But obviously, they're very used to a certain kind of ambition which expresses itself in a false friendliness, and the kind of things John Peel went through. I've been thinking about John Peel's relationship with Mark Bolan recently, how Mark dumped him, ditched him after he got famous. John Peel had given a bad review in Record Mirror or something for Get It On, I think, which was Mark's breakthrough to his new commercial sound, which was going to make him a pop star and give Mark everything he wanted. And Peel said, this is a step in the wrong direction, and was very negative about it. And then their friendship ended, and Peel was very hurt because they'd been very close, and Peel had championed him. Of course, absolutely endemic in Peel's position, where you're discovering new talent, and the new talent, some of it will take flight and go mainstream after you've championed it for a while. This happened over and over in his life, and I think he learned to detach himself from that and avoid the pain. And so when I met Peel, and there was this distant look in his eyes, and he didn't really want to engage. He was shy, but also I think it was a policy thing. He'd learned his lesson from Mark Bolan, 10 or 15 years before, and so I never developed a relationship with him, either impersonally, in terms of making the kind of records he liked, or personally.
Are you there?
That's how he was. So the next time I saw him on the street, I passed him at Covent Garden and just didn't approach him, didn't say anything. Because it would have had to be reproachful, would have had to be, why are you not playing my music? And I think I later accused him of being one of the gatekeepers, which he was. He was a cultural gatekeeper in Britain at that time. But I understand, it's not his fault. And actually, once we have this much more level playing field at the internet, it's not been particularly any easier for artists like me. I just have to realize that I'm not a resonant artist. This is another theme that's just been cropping up. I was talking about pleasures. How has it drifted into these negative thoughts? The pleasure of the sunshine. I like being indoors when the sun is shining as it is now. I can see from here, from my high eyrie above the docks of Osaka, I can see the hills of it's not actually Shikoku, it's the land bridge that crosses between Honshu and Shikoku, 2 islands of Japan, and it's called Awaji. So I can see the boats. Awaji is quite clear today, which means it's not very polluted, and I can see the ships and boats sailing in and out of Osaka harbour, the docks, enormous docks here, and very active. Actually, it's quite polluted because of all the diesel trucks carrying containerized freight from China. I do get a certain pleasure from containerized freight from China. I love cheap things, and I love going. My favourite outdoors activity is to go up to markets and flea markets or covered arcades and find cheap stuff. I always like the sense of getting a bargain. So I like the sense of finding things which would, if they were made by Comme des Garçons, would cost hundreds of euros for, you know, less than 10 euros. And I know that I have, because of my sort of cultural capital, I kind of feel I could be a clothes designer, because I do have a strong feeling for colour, form, pattern, texture, and the sensuality of fabric and this kind of thing. So what I like is to sort of on the cheap use this sensibility, which could, you know, I actually wouldn't mind launching my own line of clothes and being a designer in that sense, but what I would do would just be sort of expand my second-hand sensibility. Or I think it's kind of the other way around. I think my second-hand shopping is directed by a designer sensibility, so that I hope I manage to make cheap things look expensive. I've got some white shoes, which are sort of carpenter's Toby shoes, which cost me, $8 or something out in Amagasaki, and I think that they look like $100 shoes, or more, 200. You know, if you went to a different place and got them, you get exactly the same shoes, but they would be 10 times as much. So I do pride, and I do think there's an inherent beauty in cheapness, and even tacky, or especially tacky plastic Chinese shops that have everything for $1. I love those, and when I was in New York, I remember going into a Chinese shop. Chinatown was really my center in New York, and I loved that fact that you're in Manhattan, which is this incredibly expensive little island of privilege, a sliver of privilege there in the Hudson, between the Hudson and the East Rivers, and you have an enclave of immigrants, all very recent. The Chinese community continues to replenish itself in New York, whereas the Italian community, say, or the Ukrainians, don't. They tend to be of a certain generation, and the Ukrainians have pretty much been forced out of the East Village now because of rent increases. Somehow the Chinese held on to their particular areas, so I would gravitate, even though I was performing uptown in galleries, museums and things, I would head downtown and buy cheap accessories, all sorts of brightly coloured little pink and white striped belts and red headphones, noise reduction headphones or whatever, that looked kind of cool, just so it looked good, you know. I mean, not really although I did find New York very noisy, so I like to cut down on the noise. Pleasures, simple, cheap, everyday pleasures like that. Riding my bicycle, love it. Just got it fixed because the crank between the pedals was broken, the bearings had gone. So that's, just buying, tangerines and eating them. Christmas, forget Christmas. I'm not particularly interested in Christmas, New Year. Public holidays like that are a bit of a nightmare. I like to wait for them to go away and for everybody to be back at work, and therefore manning the shops and the tills and all the rest of it, so I can be free. I can be just sensing my own difference. I think I like to be sort of a little bit different from other people, and free when they're working. That's a great feeling. Or awake when they're asleep, to get up really early in the morning and sense that you're the only person awake and the only person free, and that you're voluntarily awake at that time. You don't have to be up at that time. It just feels very special. And it's a twilight state, it's a crepuscular state, a little bit like the one I began this by describing, this sort of sense of a kind of sort of drifty, misty sense of things not quite being in the right places, and that being a pleasure.
Open University.